Tensions between the UK and China have been ramping up. The policy shift is principally because of pressure from neocon Tory backbenchers and Donald Trump, as well as Boris Johnson looking for a distraction from his disastrous handling of coronavirus. But the policies of Xi Jinping have also become more authoritarian of late, with a harsh security law imposed on Hong Kong and new revelations emerging about the Chinese state's repression of the Uyghurs. Is this the start of a new Cold War? And how should progressives position themselves in the emerging conflict between China and the West? That's our main topic tonight. I'll be speaking in one moment to Dr. Lee Jones about that, who teaches politics and international relations at Queen Mary and specialises in the political economy of Southeast Asia. Thank you for joining us this evening, Lee.
Pleasure.
Throughout the show, of course, I'll also be joined by Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
Feeling good. How are you?
I'm very well. We might not have Aaron yet. Is that the case? He's gonna pop in slightly late, I think, to this evening's stream, but that's not a problem because we're talking China first.
I've been wanting to steal his job for quite some time.
Later in the show, we're going to talk about the latest news, the vaccine, of course, big story there. Also, the chief nurse getting dropped for refusing to back Dominic Cummings, and Dua Lipa coming out for Albanian nationalism. So that's probably the surprising story of the evening. As ever, tweet on the hashtag DiskySour and share the show link. First story. Relations between the UK and China are turning sour. Last week, the British government confirmed they would be banning the Chinese firm Huawei from supplying telecoms equipment in the country. Today, in response to the Chinese imposing a security law on Hong Kong, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab confirmed the arms embargo in place between the UK and China since 1989 will be extended to Hong Kong. He also made the following announcement on extraditions. Let's take a look.
Mr. Speaker, the second measure relates to the fact that the imposition of this new national security legislation has significantly changed key assumptions underpinning our extradition treaty arrangements with Hong Kong. And I have to say, I'm particularly concerned about Articles 55 to 59 of the law, which give mainland Chinese authorities the ability to assume jurisdiction over certain cases and to try those cases in mainland Chinese courts. Mr. Speaker, the national security law does not provide legal or judicial safeguards in such cases, and I'm also concerned about the potential reach of the extraterritorial provisions. So I've consulted with the Home Secretary, the Justice Secretary and the Attorney General, and the government has decided to suspend the extradition treaty immediately and indefinitely.
Now, on this show, we're normally fairly critical of Dominic Raab's foreign policy. We don't share any of his politics, but my first question to Lee is whether or not this announcement here seems kind of reasonable. It's a recognition the system of one country, two systems seems to be over due to this security law which has been imposed, and therefore obviously having an extradition treaty which gives us a relationship that's to Hong Kong that's different to our relationship to mainland China would seem a bit odd. So is this announcement just a common sense, uncontroversial one that Dominic Raab has made today?
Yeah, I think it should be. I mean, especially when you consider that the Conservative government has basically said that hundreds of thousands of people in Hong Kong could come to live in the UK. The kind of people that might want to come over would be people who have been politically active, for example, and can't stay in Hong Kong anymore. It would be absurd if Hong Kong was able to extradite those people back to Hong Kong, and then Beijing security agents who are now permanently stationed in the city could simply whip them out and try them on the mainland. So, this is an appropriate and sensible step, I think.
And I think probably lots of people are looking, we're going to talk about the Uyghurs in a moment, which is probably the most shocking thing going on in China at the moment. But just in terms of Hong Kong, Huawei in general, you're seeing on the one hand, Britain being pushed by Donald Trump into what looks like a sort of, a bit of a new Cold War is maybe an overstatement. I suppose you can comment on that. But it seems like we're being driven by a very right-wing politics from the United States. But at the same time, the law which is being imposed in Hong Kong does seem fairly authoritarian. And I suppose it's difficult for myself, for our audience, to separate. Is the changing narrative about China that we've been witnessing over the past few months because of changed behavior by China, or is it because of a changed attitude by Donald Trump and Boris Johnson moving in line with a hard right administration in the United States?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, but standing up to China is not something that should be seen as either hard right or hard left. And I do think that the left needs to think very carefully about what position to take on China, because it's not going anywhere. And I think the left, frankly, has been pretty silent on what's been happening in China over the last, say, 5 years, because the Chinese regime under Xi Jinping has become more authoritarian. There's no doubt that it has ramped up its oppression of the entire population, not just the Uyghurs, but the Uyghurs are a particularly egregious case, maybe up to 1 million people put into effectively concentration camps, re-education camps. The left has been really quite silent about that, even this week when those kind of shocking videos came out of people with shaved heads being marched onto trains, evocative, as many people said, of the Holocaust. And with Hong Kong, the left has been very silent on the protests in Hong Kong. What has happened over the last few years, I mean, this goes back to 2014, was when I first visited Hong Kong and the encampments there with the Occupy Central movement. The CCP has been steadily crushing Hong Kong's judicial independence and thereby the civil liberties that were guaranteed to Hong Kong residents under the handover agreement with the UK. And the CCP regime is pretty horrible. So the left needs to move beyond a knee-jerk response of just saying, well, we don't like Donald Trump, and therefore, we don't like any policies that he pursues. His policy towards China is pretty hardline and maybe not very effective, but it's rooted in some real realities, which is that the Chinese regime is pretty horrible, and China has been cheating on world trade rules for many years and hollowing out industries in the West. So the left needs to learn to take a more nuanced position, I think, on both its understanding of domestic politics in the West. I think the offer to Hong Kong people to come and live in the UK, for example, must be very surprising for those who think that the Boris Johnson government is some kind of white supremacist regime. But also, it needs to take a much more realistic and principled stance on what's happening in China.
I'm going to bring Ash in.
Hey, first-time caller, long-time listener. But I thought I would just chip in with a question, because I do agree with you that the left has been particularly bad at talking about the treatment of Uyghurs. I tweeted recently about the treatment of women, forced sterilizations, and I was denounced by a lot of people as being a CIA asset. And I've never been described as an asset to anybody, so that was new to me. But the question that I wanted to ask you was less about the treatment of the Uyghurs and more a matter of trade and a kind of realignment in global capital. This is an argument which I read in Laurie McFarlane's piece in The Guardian this week, which is saying that the kind of saber rattling over Huawei, yes, some of the fears around security are well-founded, but really what it's got more to do with is a lack of confidence in the Anglo-American model of capitalism, and a fear that China's come up with something which is more resilient, better at dealing with shocks to global markets than Britain and America, and that you're going to see a huge realignment in terms of geo-economic power. What did you make of that argument?
Well, there is some truth to it, I think, to a certain extent. I mean, I do think that the trade war with China has got a lot to do with the success that China has had in climbing value chains, value-added ladder, if you like. China is not willing to be permanently locked into a peripheral position in global value chains of just doing low value-added manufacturing for Western companies. It's determined to climb up the value-added ladder by hook or crook. And if that means stealing intellectual property rights, for example, industrial espionage and so on, to help develop indigenous Chinese products as part of a Made in China 2025 agenda, then it will do that. And it has been doing that. That's simply a fact. And that is much more of a threat to the profits of the most dominant fractions of Western capital, especially American capital, than any other developing country, because China can do this at scale. And it is using its state banks to subsidize the expansion of its state-owned enterprises overseas, and so on. So this is a model of capitalism which is ridden with all kinds of contradictions. Let's not pretend that this is somehow more stable and some kind of perfect system. It isn't. It has all kinds of problems. But it is, I think, one that has been uniquely beneficial to Western capital over the last, say, 30 years. But the two models are becoming less and less compatible because it's starting to eat into the profit margins of dominant tech firms. I think that's one of the main kind of spurs of the breakdown in the US-China relationship. So that's certainly part of it.
We're going to go to a clip briefly, which was on the Andrew Marr show yesterday. So he was joined by the Chinese ambassador to the UK and challenged him to explain footage which emerged of Uyghur people being blindfolded and forced onto trains, as Lee mentioned earlier. We're going to take a look at that clip now.
Let's look at some very disturbing drone footage that's been widely shared around the world. This is almost certainly over northern China, over Xinjiang. Can you tell us what is happening here?
I cannot see, this video. This is not the first time you show me. I still remember last year you showed me what is happening in Xinjiang.
In Xinjiang, exactly.
But let me tell you this. Xinjiang, have you been to Xinjiang yourself?
No, I never have.
Xinjiang is regarded as the most beautiful place in Xinjiang. There's a Chinese saying, you do not know how big China is.
Ambassador, that is not beautiful coverage, however, is it?
Xinjiang, that is exactly what I'm going to tell you. Since 1990, Xinjiang has completely changed because there's thousands of terrorist attacks. People cannot. That
was 10 years ago. Can I ask you why people are kneeling, blindfolded and shaven and being led to trains in modern China? Why? What is going on there?
I do not know where you get this videotape. Sometimes you have a transfer of prisons and prisoners. In any country.
But just what is happening here, Ambassador?
I do not know. Where did you get these video clips?
These have been going around the world. They've been authenticated by Western intelligence agencies and by Australian experts who say these are Uyghur people being pushed onto trains and taken off.
Let me tell you this. The so-called Western intelligence keeping up make this a false accusation against China. They said 1 million Uyghurs has been persecuted. How many population Xinjiang has? It's just about 40 years ago, it's 4-5 million. Now it's 11 million people. And people say, we impose, we have ethnic cleansing, but the population has doubled in the 40 years.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but according to your own local government statistics, the population growth in Uyghur jurisdictions in that area has fallen by 84% between 2015 and 2018. 84%.
That's not right. I gave you an official figure. You ask me, I gave you this figure as a Chinese ambassador. This is a very authoritative figure. In the past 40 years, the Uyghur population increased, the population in Xinjiang increased to double. The population doubled. So there's no so-called restriction of the population. There's no so-called forced abortion and so on.
So that was the Chinese ambassador there, not really having any good answers. There was also an interview that was shown of someone, a Uyghur person from Xinjiang, who had been, or I think had been subjected to sterilization. You saw the Chinese ambassador make this really right-wing argument. You often hear it in Israel-Palestine actually a lot in that argument where people or advocates of the Israeli government will say, "Well, what do you mean a genocide? There's so many Palestinians." It's a very similar, very far-right argument being made. Lee, I want to go to you first. Obviously, the Chinese ambassador there was, not contextualizing what was going on. He just said, "I don't know what you're talking about," denying it all. Beyond, us just seeing there are some horrible things going on in China. Could you sort of contextualize this? How do we make sense of what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs?
So, that was a dreadful performance by the Chinese ambassador. I imagine he might be replaced quite soon. One thing he said was true, which is that the population of Xinjiang has increased. But what he neglects to mention is that it's increased mostly through Han Chinese transmigration, which has been encouraged by the government to dilute the Uyghur majority. So there's been a strong campaign for many years to try to dilute the Uyghur population. The basic the basic issue there is that in China's western part, not only in Xinjiang but other parts, there are ethnic minorities and religious minorities, and so the Uyghurs are Muslims who share more kind of culturally, linguistically, ethnically with people in Central Asia. And the concern since the late 80s has been a population rebelling against Chinese rule, essentially, and becoming more religious, and religion being one of the main ways in which people come together socially, and to some extent organized politically. So there's been a lot of fear that this is a sort of fifth column. Their loyalty is not really to the Chinese state, they're really to their brethren across borders, this kind of thing. So there's been escalating security measures and crackdowns since the late 1980s, but they've really intensified over the last 7 or 8 years. And it's part of a global war on terror, I suppose, if you like, the kind of securitization of Muslim populations. They're not seen potentially as loyal to the host country, their own country, and they may be seen as more loyal to outside. And so that's what's driving this. Whether one wants to call it a genocide, I mean, it's always a loaded term. It's used for political purposes more than kind of analytical and descriptive purposes. But if it is true, of course, that the Chinese government is in some cases imposing sterilization, which the reports seem to suggest, then that would fall under the definition of genocide, because you're trying to eradicate a population through forced sterilization. So these are the kinds of policies that have been going on in Xinjiang over the last, say, 7 or 8 years, intensifying under Xi Jinping. And this has been known about for a long time. And this is why, although it is a factor in the way that certain people in the West are now thinking about China, it's not something that suddenly happened which has caused people to react. This was known a good year ago, when there's been very good coverage, particularly in The Guardian, investigative reporting, getting Chinese government documents, getting satellite images showing that this was actually happening. That was known at the time, and no really severe actions were taken against China until quite recent.
I think we're bringing Ash back in.
Yeah, sorry, attention seeking again. Two things that I wanted to suggest. One is to try and make sense of why the left has been quite weak in talking about this. Because I don't think it's simply a case of, retaining some kind of enchantment about the Chinese Communist Party. I think that one, it's an understanding of imperialism generally as a uniquely European phenomenon, feeling quite troubled about having to make sense of Chinese imperialism, having to make sense of Indian imperialism, because it doesn't stack up with, an important historic interrogation of European history. And I think there's a level of discomfort there, and almost an unwillingness to talk about imperialism, violence, and expansion in the global South, when one of the main differences isn't in the severity of the violence or its impact on civilian populations. It was just that European countries were able to do it, outside of the metropole. So I think that is an element of the discomfort. I think another reason is because I do think that when it comes to the left in this country, it's been shaped so powerfully by the war on terror. So my first politicization, like it was for lots of people my age, was the invasion of Iraq. And out of that came a real mistrust of what you might call liberal international relations. And I think without having a really solid left critique of what's going on in China, what's happening to the Uyghurs, what's happening in terms of state surveillance, there's an impulse to fall back on that critique of liberal international relations, being very skeptical of the sources of information, but not being able to put anything else forward, any other kind of explanation, any other kind of critique or analysis. But just a question that I wanted to ask. One of the things that was quite striking was the list of countries which had expressed support for Chinese policies in Xinjiang, including where I've got family, Bangladesh, Nigeria, many countries in the global south. And so the question that I wanted to ask was, is this simply a case of countries which want the freedom to deal with their own dissidents without, having human rights observers breathing down their necks? Or is it the result of, the eye-watering sums of money coming into, Bangladesh, many other countries in the form of Chinese FDI?
What I'm going to do is superimpose myself here, because we're going to go to you for your final comment in a moment, Lee, because we're going to have to let you go soon. But I want to get Aaron in first to see if Aaron's got an intervention to make before we throw that question to Lee.
Yeah, I had a question. Thanks, Lee. Really, really, really interesting insights. To what extent has East Turkestan, Xinjiang, historically, I'm not referring to the last several years, been seen by Western powers as an opportunity to interfere or intervene in Chinese politics? So we see that, for instance, with the partition of India, creating a certain mistrust between the Muslim League and the Congress Party. We see that with the Belgians when they leave the Congo, Katanga, where most of the mineral resources are, they see that as an opportunity to keep themselves there. Is there any because I'm not familiar with it, hence I'm asking the question, is there a history of trying to leverage sort of cultural differences between the Han Chinese and the Muslim Uyghur population by Western powers?
No, not that I'm aware of. I don't generally think that the Western powers are particularly interested in intervening in China's internal affairs when it comes to Xinjiang. The global war on terror really gave kind of carte blanche to a lot of countries to treat its Muslim populations pretty badly under the cover of global security. And that included China. So criticism of Chinese human rights abuses abated under the war on terror. And I think what Ash says about the position of the left is very insightful, that there does seem to be a view on the contemporary left that, colonialism, imperialism and racism are the exclusive preserve of white people and the West. And obviously it's not. And there are indeed many worse things going on in some developing countries. And in many cases, what developing countries have had to do, and this is just a part of the process of state formation, frankly, is that they engage in a process of internal colonialism. This was a concept developed, for example, to explain Thailand's nation building, that you have a state that covers a particular territory, but the people in that territory are not homogenous. And so you engage in a process of forced homogenization through a variety of sticks and carrots. And sometimes that process is extremely brutal. And that's essentially what's happening in China. That's probably the best way to think about it. It's part of the nation building process, but the Chinese nation is an imperial formation, as it is in many countries. So that's really what's going on. And I think the best way for the left to think about this is not through a prism of a kind of crude, anti-imperialism, therefore anti-Westernism, but think of it in terms of principle, that the principle that the left should stand for above all else is freedom. It's liberation from oppression, it's liberation from necessity. And the question is to what extent the different regimes around the world allow for that. And the Chinese regime, in many ways, has liberated some people from some of the worst aspects of necessity, although there's still terrible poverty and exploitation has massively intensified. But on other freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to join political parties, there is no such freedom in China these days, especially. It was a little bit more liberal, say 10 years ago, but those freedoms have been extinguished. And so the left should take a principled position and criticize restrictions on freedom wherever it finds them. That doesn't necessarily mean siding with Donald Trump against Xi Jinping. It can mean siding against both.
And on Ash's question about is the support for China amongst much of the world because of investments, is it for financial reasons, or is it because they also want carte blanche to oppress their own dissidents?
I think it's a mixture of both. Like I said, a lot of these countries, you think about Nigeria, for example, Nigeria has incredible levels of internal diversity and suffered a civil war early in its history. Nigeria also has good economic relations with China. So I think it's a mixture of those two things. And they also, of course, developing countries have had direct experience of the weaponization of concerns about human rights abuses. And there, the suspicion about liberal internationalism is exactly right. And this is part of the conundrum for the left, is if you call out human rights abuses in developing countries, the question then becomes, well, who is going to enforce human rights rules and norms? And of course, it always falls to the most powerful countries in the system. And we know over the last 20 years that that intervention has led, as the title of one book, recent excellent book puts it, cosmopolitan dystopia, right? The destruction of states in developing countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and others, and total disorder, and far less respect for basic human rights than existed previously because of that disorder. So developing countries are quite right to be suspicious, but at the same time, developing countries are also led by people who have an interest in being able to use coercion against their own domestic dissident forces. So their hands are not clean either. So the task for the Western left really is to steer between these different forces and recognize their different interests and take a principled position that might well involve saying, you know, all of these groups are nefarious in their own ways, and none of them we should support 100%.
Dr. Lee Jones, thank you so much for your time this evening. That was all incredibly insightful. We're going to talk about how this all impacts British politics. And to sort of set this off, because I think this does all put us in a bit of an uncomfortable position, really. To set off this discussion, I'm going to go to a excerpt from the Times Red Box email this morning. So it says, there's also some evidence to support an accusation made by a Tory MP to me last week that China is replacing the EU as Leave voters' favoured bogeyman. The Brexit Party, remember them, emailed members this weekend in a missive dominated by a rant against the evils of the East Asian superpower. And I think this is, you know, the insight contained in that paragraph is something that we can probably all recognize from social media, which is this opportunity to bash China is being jumped on by many of the most bashing a foreign country inhabited by non-white people.
So this chimes with the contemporary themes of UK politics because, one, it's Red Scare. So it's a way of discrediting an explicitly socialist left in this country by saying, look at what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, you know, look at your age mates, essentially. Two, it's yellow peril. So it's age-old racism against Chinese people, the way in which that dovetails with a shifting of the blame regarding coronavirus. And then three, this kind of, it's kind of Anglo-American capital's last gasp of being confronted with the rise of China. What do? Do you align yourself with, you know, the huge trading bloc on your doorstep, the EU? No, you go limping after the American empire, which is very much in decay. So that's why some of these issues have had this particular political salience. It also goes very nicely, and I think that this is the way in which these things are understood through cultural frames, is that the conspiratorial thinking of the far right, in particular with this idea of a Wuhan virology lab and that coronavirus is actually a bioweapon, is that it does, I think, reproduce these themes of yellow peril, of Chinese people are not to be trusted, they're scheming, they're duplicitous. And so I think that's why China has been, why it occupies that place in the political imagination. Whereas it's true, there are lots of countries which, subjugate and oppress its own citizens and internal population. And yet we don't see their ambassadors being pulled onto Andrew Marr. But, I do think it's really important to think about what happens when we witness cultural eradication happening in real time, because this isn't something which was contained to the early period of colonialism when it comes to European and settler colonial powers. One of the things that I thought about when I saw the footage of men being taken onto trains, the accounts of children being put into schools where they're being taught to kind of disavow Uyghur culture, was the stolen generations, which was the process in Australia where indigenous children were forcibly removed from their parents and educated out of their own indigenous culture. And this went on right the way up until the 1970s in Australia. So it's something which is a technique and a technology of governance, which has its own kind of imperial pedigree. And so I think that's why, we can't just talk about, I don't know, a neutral process of the making of a nation state and the need to, make Chinese people. It is something that we've seen happen before. And I think that's why we need to think about what kind of strategy is appropriate for the left to adopt.
We've got 2,000 people watching. The next story is a good news one. So now is the time to share the show link and people can find out about a new vaccine. We've also got a comment, Pipatandi with $50 Australian. Would love to see a show on Indonesia's neo-colonial oppression in West Papua. That sounds like it's going to be in Aaron's area of expertise, but we'll definitely work on that. Next story. Coronavirus has already taken 600,000 lives and brought the global economy to a standstill. Since it began, we've learned social distancing, test and trace, as well as targeted lockdowns can all limit the damage done by the virus. But the one thing that would really get us out of this crisis, is a vaccine. Today, we received some good news on that front. So results from phase 1 in the trial of the Oxford vaccine found that it generated an immune response to coronavirus and had only mild side effects for the 1,077 adults on whom it was trialed. We can get up some copy from The Guardian, some comment from the people that ran this trial. They say the results were a really important milestone on the path to a vaccine, said the study's lead author, Professor Andrew Pollard. They showed that the vaccine was very well tolerated by more than 1,000 volunteers. We are seeing exactly the sort of immune response we were hoping for, including neutralizing antibodies and T-cell responses, which, at least from what we've seen in the animal studies, seem to be those that are associated with protection. The problem is, he said, we just don't know what level is needed if you meet this virus in the wild to provide protection. So we need to do the clinical trials and to work that out. So this is, well, as he's saying, there's still lots of uncertainty, but at the end of a phase 1 trial, they've found out exactly what they would like to see, which is that this vaccine creates antibodies and T-cells. Antibodies, they attach to the virus and neutralize it. T-cells attack it, destroy the virus. They work together like a double-pronged attack, and it does both. But as he says, they're not quite sure yet how it's going to respond to the virus in the wild. So whilst this clearly gives you some immunity, they don't know if it gives you enough immunity, how long it will last. What's going to come next is phase 2. Well, phase 2 of the trial is just to try it out on some younger people and older people. It's mainly people who are 18 to, or all people who are 18 to 55 who've been tested in this first trial. But it's the phase 3 that's the big one, and this is when we'll actually find out if this vaccine is a goer. So this is the phase 3. Is when you give it to tens of thousands of people. You give half of them a placebo, half of them the actual vaccine, and then you see which group got more coronavirus. What if the vaccine group got more? That's terrible. But what you'd like to see is that the one who'd got the non-placebo were less likely to get coronavirus than the others. Let's get out some copy about what phase 3 is going to look like. So more than 10,000 people will take part in the next stage of the trials in the UK. However, the trial has also been expanded to other countries because levels of coronavirus are low in the UK, making it hard to know if the vaccine is effective. There will be a large trial involving 30,000 people in the US, as well as 2,000 in South Africa and 5,000 in Brazil. There are also calls to perform challenge trials in which vaccinated people are deliberately infected with coronavirus. However, there are ethical concerns due to a lack of treatments. Those challenge trials are a very interesting concept. That would speed up the whole thing because you don't just need to do, you don't have to give 5,000 people the vaccine and 5,000 people a placebo, then let them out in society and come back in 3 months' time and see who got more coronavirus. You just, dangle a bit of coronavirus around someone's nose who's just been vaccinated, and then you can find out within a week instead of within 3 months. But yeah, it seems like they've got some ethical qualms about doing that. Perfectly understandable. I'll go to you first, Ash. This seems like a big deal, a big breakthrough. The coronavirus nightmare could be over within months.
Well, yeah, it could be, and it depends on the result of these larger clinical trials. I, for one, am keeping my fingers crossed. I am saying inshallah, because, you know, as fun as it's been getting an insight into your home life, Michael, I'm ready for us all to be back in the studio and all together. One of the things that I would say is that I think sometimes the way in which vaccine news is reported is intended, I think, to take some of the sting out of public anger. So very early on in the coronavirus crisis, we were hearing tales of vaccines going to be out and on the shelves in September. And I think it was a way of reassuring the public that this isn't going to be forever. But the bad thing about that is that it means that we start taking measures to adapt our lives to living with this virus being at some level in society less seriously. It means that people, I think, become less patient with the existence of a lockdown, less likely to want to go back into one if infection rates increase. And my concern sometimes with the reporting of this story is that it gives everyone kind of a false sense of security. I was talking to my best mate who lives in Barcelona, and the infection rate started to creep up again. So cinemas were open, they've closed down again. Public pools were open, they've now closed down again. And there's one little village in the outskirts of Barcelona which has gone into a full lockdown already. So there are people in Barcelona who are now thinking, well, are we going to go back into a very strict lockdown? What you need in terms of public morale and public buy-in to the efforts in fighting coronavirus is a level of consistent willpower. And I kind of think in this country, especially with how early on in the crisis cycle these reports of a vaccine were coming out, and quite lurid promises were being made, all it serves to do is put us in a weaker position should we have to take more drastic action in a month, 2 months, 3 months, or even 6.
I mean, it could be the opposite though, right? Because I suppose you could look at it, if people don't see a vaccine in sight, then you say, fuck it, we're all going to get it anyway. You know, it might as well be sooner rather than later. You know, we can't live like this forever. Whereas if they told us, you know, the vaccine's going to be ready in December, then everyone's just like, fuck it, we'll do a proper lockdown until December. I definitely don't want this, considering there might be some long-term effects. I'll just bunker down for the next 6 months. So I think the opposite could happen, where because people see an end in sight, they're more willing to take firmer action right now because they see that it's only going to be temporary.
I mean, I think there's validity to that argument, but I don't buy it for 1 second. And the reason why I don't buy it for 1 second is because you have to look at it within the context of the media coverage so far and how that's impacted on people's behavior. Can you say with 100% clarity, as someone who is deeply plugged into the news cycle, that you know what all the rules are regarding
No.
traveling to different bits of the country, how many households can interact? You know, can you see someone who's shielding? What are the rules for someone who's shielding? Can you say with 100% confidence that you know those things?
No, I don't, but I do Google them because I am a stickler for the rules.
You are a stickler for the rules.
No, I don't Google them every time I make a plan.
I mean, I have to Google this stuff too. It's not knowledge which is lodged in there, but I can actually remember a lot about these clinical trials. I know about the promises that were being made about antibody tests being as easy as a pregnancy test. The good news is designed to stick in your mind, whereas we've got this kind of, I think, constructive fudging around the rules that we're supposed to abide by. So when this news comes in at a time where it's not just lockdown that's loosening, but you know, government comms around it is just kind of being turned into like a, you know, weird, nebulous mass of maybe you should do this, but common sense, do these two conflicting things at the same time. I think that that's the thing which might have detrimental effects. It's not that I don't like, I love good news. I just I also want good media, and we don't have it.
Aaron, what do you make of the vaccine news? I mean, Boris Johnson, after a completely catastrophic response to coronavirus, 65,000 people dead, he is going to be, you know, delighted if the global solution to coronavirus comes from Britain, comes from Oxford. Although, of course, on balance, I want whoever to make the vaccine as soon as goddamn possible. This is great news, but you can see how you know, many of the wrong people are going to be rejoicing at this as well.
Well, I mean, it's immensely prestigious. Whichever country comes up with it first, you know, rightly, I think they would take a great deal of pleasure in doing that. I mean, to be fair, one of the things which Britain remains world class in is you know, biological sciences. There aren't many things that apply to, obviously, a couple of the world's most successful pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, based in Britain, or significantly based in Britain. Not that innovation is done, by the way, by many pharmaceutical companies under capitalism, but it was always highly plausible that Britain will be a world leader in this. That's not the case necessarily elsewhere with AI or manufacturing, but here it was always plausible. It's a good news story. I agree with Ash. I think it's very difficult to how do you engage with these kinds of stories in a digital era, in the era of Twitter? Multiple tests, sample size of tens of thousands of people, repeat tests, placebo tests, blind tests. These really aren't made for the sort of social media age. And of course, there could be adverse consequences. Now, I'm not familiar with the adverse consequences attendant with vaccines. I'm not somebody that comes from a health sciences background, but there are obviously well-documented instances of new medicines being rolled out and them having incredibly adverse consequences. And I'm not talking about MMR.
Everyone was like, whoa,
oh my God.
Didn't see that coming.
I'm talking about, for instance, thalidomide children and so on. And nobody's saying that's likely here, but you need multiple stage trials to ensure that doesn't happen. And so I think it's really important to say, do not rush this. However, so far, it's really, really good news. Very positive.
I saw you tweet today. I thought it was quite interesting. You're saying this is, the example in our lifetime of the moonshot, where sort of the governments say, the governments of the world are basically saying, we'll throw as much money at the smartest people to solve this problem in a shorter period of time, which, reminds one of JFK's plan to get to the moon.
Yeah.
And it is the kind of attitude and policy platform that could be, incredibly fruitful if it were applied to something like climate change. But, governments struggle without a global pandemic in this situation, sort of imposing the absolute necessity on them to get involved. So I suppose, to throw that back as a question, do you think this could be, if this turns out to be successful, if the Oxford trial turns out to be successful, is this going to be something that the left can jump on to say, let's do this about a whole range of other innovations that, we as a society desperately need?
I think absolutely. I think if you can create a vaccine for a condition within 12 months, not just create the vaccine, generate the response, but also to actually produce it at scale. We're looking at hundreds of millions of doses potentially quite quickly. I think clearly that would make the argument incredibly strong to say that, look, we don't need to talk about decarbonizing the global economy by 2060, 2070. If we're being honest, we could do that in 2 or 3 years. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But that's basically the scale of the endeavor we're presently seeing with the coronavirus. Or equally, a couple of million people die every year today because of a lack of clean drinking water. That could be ended within months. Of course, the difference between something like climate change and clean drinking water is that uniquely afflicts the global south. But I think with climate change, there is absolutely no reason that we couldn't address it using the exact same frame. Of course, the response from market fundamentalists would be, well, it's the likes of, GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca who've managed to do it. They're private companies. Partially true, but they're not doing it because they're responding to a market mechanism. They're doing it because nation states are saying, look, we'll buy hundreds of millions of doses. And also, if we don't produce this as quickly as possible, business as usual certainly can't happen, but also many, many millions of people will die. So it's going to be an ideological battle that the left has to win. The argument has to be made, but it also has to be won. But I think it's a pretty easy one to begin, right? You can say, well, look, as a species, we did this in a year. Why can't we use that ingenuity elsewhere?
You might also be giving a bit too much credit to AstraZeneca in a way, because I think the pure science of it was done by professors at Oxford University, a publicly funded institution. From what I've read, they got AstraZeneca involved because they needed, the manufacturing capacity to scale it up and how to bring it to market.
But that's most innovations, right? Virtually no major innovation since the Second World War has been done responding to the market. It's been diffused by market actors.
But then the argument that needs, that we're all going to have is who gets to, profit, or how much does AstraZeneca get to profit from this vaccine, given that so much of the effort that went into it was publicly funded. And that's going to be, a big debate. It's exactly what Mariana Mazzucato writes about. It's that, so much of the innovation comes from the public institution, but then it's the private company that then owns this innovation.
Value creation and value capture. The public sector is creating the value, the private sector is capturing it.
we are going to go now to, we've got, I suppose we can call it, are we going to call this the best of Britain? I don't know, that sounds big. Well, a good news story about Britain. We're going to call that, that's the best I'm going to say about this vaccine. We're going to now go to the stories we're more used to, which is Britain being a joke when it comes to coronavirus, or at least its handling of coronavirus. First of all, though, if you're enjoying this show, please do subscribe and click that notification bell. When Dominic Cummings broke the lockdown rules and the government insulted all of our intelligence by insisting he hadn't, the nation's hopes fell on the government scientists to cut through Boris Johnson's crap. The problem, as it turned out, why we didn't see this as often as we might have liked, was that if the scientists threatened to speak out against Cummings, they were pulled from public view. So this, we found out today, is what happened to the chief nurse, Ruth May, who was due to appear at the daily Downing Street briefing on the 1st of June. But after a practice round of Q&As, was asked to stand down. These latest details emerged today in the Public Accounts Committee in the Commons. And we can go to the copy from the HuffPo with some quotes. So Ruth May told the Commons Public Accounts Committee on Monday that she was asked in the preparatory session for her view of the lockdown rules and the actions of Cummings. Yes, of course I was asked about lockdown and rules to lockdown. Yes. Asked for her view of Cummings' conduct, she told the MPs, I believe that in my opinion, the rules were clear. They were there for everyone's safety and they applied to us all. Pushed again to include that in terms that included the PM's chief aide, she replied, they certainly applied to all of us. Then she says, I don't know why I was dropped from the briefing. I'm afraid you would have to ask other people that. So many people were suspicious at the time when she was billed to appear at that briefing and then she was dropped, that the reason was she wasn't going to speak in a positive way about what Dominic Cummings has done. She was going to tell the truth ultimately. And now in her testimony to MPs, it seems that was the case. The government did know that she was going to say, yes, Dominic Cummings should have followed the rules like everyone else. And so they dropped her from that briefing. Obviously, the government were not honest about the reasons why she was pulled at the time. We're going to get up a tweet from a Telegraph journalist at the time of the story. Can we get this up? At the time the story came out, Downing Street said Ruth May had missed the press conference because she was stuck in traffic. So that is a complete lie. Anna Mikhailova is not a leftist who's desperate to make up stuff about the government. She's a Telegraph journalist. This is true. The government lied to the public again. Also over something stupid. So many of the lies that the public have told, that the government have told, my apologies to the public, have just been, these silly little things where they didn't want to lose face and they just sort of lie like it's nothing. Why not? I suppose your comments on this, both of you, but also I kind of want to throw out there a more depressing thought, which is that, the strategy that the government pursued, which was to say, look, we can ride this out. This Dominic Cummings guy is very valuable to us. Who cares if we have to lie to the public for a week and sort of lose a bit of face and completely undermine and collapse all of the public health advice we've been giving out for the past 3 months. We want to keep this guy in this story. We'll pass. Something that Labour politicians tend to be quite bad at doing. Keir Starmer fires people the moment they do a bad tweet. But it seems to have worked, right? The Tories are still ahead of Labour in the polls. Boris Johnson's popularity has taken a hit, but he's still competitive, sometimes ahead of Keir Starmer in terms of favoured Prime Minister. And I think they'll probably be fairly happy with how all of this has gone. Am I right, Ash?
Well, yes. The mechanisms for accountability in this country are completely broken. So I think a really big part of that, and it's not just our supine media culture, because actually I do think that this was the case where the lobby were furious and they really wanted to see Cummings go. They really did want the scalp. But the issue is that how do you shame someone out of office when shame itself is dead? And this has been the Johnson-Cummings playbook from the start. It doesn't matter how egregious the falsehood. For example, yes, Andrew Neil, I will appear in your television show. It doesn't matter how much disdain is demonstrated for the public. Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, the Grenfell victims simply lacked common sense. If you just barrel on through, maybe you have particular key figures have a bit of a low profile for a bit, you can expect that the news cycle will move on. And other than saying, hey, that thing was quite bad, where are our checks and our balances? What's our means for holding powerful people to account? We don't have them anymore. And that's not something which is merely an invention of the Tory party. I do think that the degradation of standards in public life was something which was also spearheaded by some notable new Labour politicians as well. The multiple resignations of Peter Mandelson. He should have only had to do one. You should only have to resign in disgrace once. You don't come back and go, oh shit, got caught doing something awful again. See ya. See you in 6 months. So I do think that that's something which has been a long and a continual process. But we're kind of at its apex now, and I don't really see a way back from where we are.
Aaron, do you agree with that? This is just what politics is now. If you want to, well, I suppose another way to put this though is obviously Jeremy Corbyn was never able to do this. If there was a controversy that he didn't deal with and that he just tried to ride through, then it would be a story for 3 years. There would never, the news cycle would never move on. So do you think this is this something that we on the left might look at and think, God, maybe we should try and do that. Maybe we should just try and ride out controversies and say, fuck it, the news cycle will move on. Or do you think it would be deluded to think that the left can do what Boris Johnson did in this situation?
I think to an extent the left has to learn some lessons around resilience, and you don't always need to be incredibly popular to be doing the right thing. And actually, we need to give the left more credit than perhaps we do sometimes. I think that was the case actually generally on the European Union stuff. I think the line that Labour had on accepting a soft Brexit consensus, that held up pretty well actually, despite a barrage of attacks by the establishment, the centre in particular. They held up pretty well for about 18 months, 2 years. And so I don't think it's the left is so soft-bellied. I think they gave it a really good shot, but it wasn't quite enough in the end. I don't think it's a particularly level playing field. I think we all agree on that. But I think it's really important to say, Ash is right. The sense of decency in politics, the sense of doing the right thing, public service, it really was emptied out under New Labour. And there's a lot of books on this. Peter Oborn, for instance, The Rise of Political Lying. This idea of a Mandarin political class in think tanks, effectively trying to undermine the impartiality of the civil service, this fusion of public relations and politics. This doesn't begin with Boris Johnson. This begins with Tony Blair, and it's really important for us to keep on saying this. And Ash is right, Peter Mandelson, he resigned twice, and guess what? He came back a third time. And he didn't just have some Mickey Mouse job. He was the industry czar for one of the world's largest economies in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, as Labour had to actually generate, from nothing, an industrial policy for the first time in 30 years that actually meant something beyond globalization is good. And so I think it's really important to locate the sort of genesis of that. Of course, the Tories did appalling things before Labour came to power in 1997. But this idea of a revolving door between politics and between public relations and lobbying, that really comes to the fore with a new genre of politics championed by New Labour. And actually, to return to contemporary ongoing events, we see it with the announcements of Chuka Umunna and Luciana Berger to Edelman. Edelman, one of the top people at Edelman is Angie Hunter. She was known as kind of Tony Blair's bulldog, his Rottweiler. And there's an interesting relationship between New Labour people and Edelman. Edelman has been involved in some of the most appalling anti-democratic propaganda. I mean, I'm not even going to dignify it with the word public relations. The Keystone Pipeline, pro-smoking lobby back in the day, Walmart, climate change deniers, the list goes on. And yet this is exactly the kind of business that people like Chuka Umunna, Luciana Berger, Angie Hunter, many other people, by the way, who've very recently worked for Labour, who now work at Edelman or who have recently worked for Edelman. So I think this is a big problem, but I think, we can't just look to the Tories today. We need to understand there's a broader historical sweep here, which goes back 20, 30 years, and it goes to both sides of the political divide.
We're going to go to our final story. It's a good one. Before we do that, if you're enjoying the show, if you want to support Novara Media, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do so, thank you so much. You are what makes this show possible. 2020 has brought us a bunch of unexpected developments: a global pandemic, the biggest uprising against racism since the 1960s, and rapidly increasing tensions between the world's two major superpowers. But an event last night was even less likely to have appeared on anyone's 2020 bingo. Grammy and Brit Award-winning artist Dua Lipa, who made Spotify's 4th most streamed album of all time, tweeted this to her 5.6 million followers on Twitter. Autochthonous, which is an adjective of an inhabitant of a place, indigenous rather than descended from migrants or colonists. And then you've got a map there, autochthonous. Most people, when they first saw that, were kind of like, well, what am I looking at? What has this pop star just tweeted? But, you know, once you do the research, I kind of like it when pop stars sort of tweet, you know, curveball political things, because it just means you learn some new stuff. But anyway, that was a map of Greater Albania. That flag which she shared. Greater Albania is an irredentist concept that seeks to unify the lands that many Albanians consider to form their national homeland, based on claims on the present day or historical presence of Albanian populations in those areas. And we can get up the map of Greater Albania, which also sort of suggests the reason it's somewhat controversial, which is that it would include parts of Montenegro, Serbia, Macedonia, and Greece. So it's a form of ethnic nationalism. It's saying that all parts of or that part of Europe which contains an Albanian population, or which is historically populated by people of Albanian ethnicity, should become part of a greater Albanian nation. Ash, I'll go to you first. Dua Lipa and Greater Albania. I mean, I kind of rate it because obviously I don't rate the concept of Greater Albania, but I like her managers will be fucking screaming at her. They'll be like, why did you tweet this? You know, they probably have an audience, you know, they probably sell records in Greece and Macedonia and in these other countries. So for her to just tweet that out to her 5.6 million followers was presumably controversial. Your thoughts?
I mean, look, call me old-fashioned, but I'm not really into ethno-states. That's just my position as a leftist. I don't think ethno-states are ever progressive. If I have to do a Lloyd Russell Moyle non-apology after saying that highly controversial opinion, catch me next week. But no, they're not progressive. And I think what this speaks to is two things. One is the way in which historical wounds are carried down through the generations. So when you have a people which has been fragmented across different national borders because of conflicts, treaties, the movement of history, right? There's often a sense that this is a collective trauma, because often that process has been very traumatic. And sometimes that collective trauma can be wielded for really reactionary and horrible ends. So, for instance, after the Treaty of Trianon, in which Hungary was carved up after World War I, that's been this kind of nurtured wound, which has also then had an impact on nationalism, even anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism. It's this idea of we are once strong, proud people tied to this land were butchered, right? We were dismembered. When it comes to the existence of a Greater Albania, as far as I can tell, the only time in which it has really existed in history was under Nazi occupation during World War II. So it's something which has, I think, particularly horrible origins, even if Dua Lipa, having been shaped by her, parents' experiences as Kosovan refugees, really horrible impact of trauma, displacement, and violence, you might have legitimate reasons to feel, quite assertive in her Albanian identity. The map that you see on the flag, when you see an abstracted map like that, you don't really know what kind of landmass it covers. And the first time I saw that flag was when a football match had to be stopped because a drone had flown in with the Greater Albanian flag. And I didn't realize just how much landmass that includes, because it doesn't just include Kosovo, but it also includes bits of Northern Macedonia and Greece, huge areas of land in which you do have diverse populations. Now, I believe in, the protected right of a people to self-determination. That's not the same thing as the right to forming an ethno-state, regardless of the wishes of the other people who live there. And I actually think, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy is a value in itself. So, yeah, Dua Lipa, bit of a curveball, bit weird. Not that into it. Not into ethno-states.
Aaron, what do you make? I mean, to be honest, it seems like a niche. It seems like a surprising thing to tweet for the as a British pop star, but it's not a rare opinion. So I found a poll from 2010 conducted by Gallup, in cooperation with the European Fund for the Balkans. I'm not sure who the European Fund for the Balkans are, but Gallup, obviously a highly rated polling firm. 62% of respondents in Albania, 81% in Kosovo, and 51.9% of respondents in Macedonia supported the formation of a greater Albania. What do you make of this tweet?
Well, I think before we go any further, we need to find out what Rita Ora thinks. Secondly, when you said, what's that? I mean, it's quite funny, the tweet. What does the word mean? What is this landmass? What is that national insignia? Who are these two guys? It's like none of it is remotely understandable to the average person. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You're basically asking for Yugoslav Civil War Mark II. That's kind of crazy. And look, there's a broader context here, which is about, for instance, Kosovo. There's a good argument to say that Kosovo and Albania could be one country and so on. But irredentism, which is the idea that there is a part of the nation which is yet to be turned back to the kind of redeemed, so to speak, is obviously a very old concept. You get it in Italy before the First World War. I think that's actually where it comes from, l'Italia irredente. So parts of Dalmatia, for instance, which is modern-day Croatia, were really parts of it. They're essentially Italian. Now, this concept can go back, very far. We could talk about Greek irredentism would probably have most of northern Turkey, right? Or
Calais, we want Calais back.
You could go back. Korean irredentism. You might want bits of Manchuria. Indian irredentism. You might ask for reunification of the Maurya Empire. So you'd go all the way to.
I'm going to say the modern day Indian economy does not want Bangladesh.
Well, yeah, you go from Herat to Bangladesh, basically, right? So there are dozens of countries which have a very feasible, historically, explicable irredentism. But Ash is right. I think what's really interesting about the case here of Albania is that historically it's been a very marginalized, unique country in Europe. I think historically it's maybe the only, along with Bosnia, they're very rare in being majority Muslim countries in Europe, and that sort of the amalgam of Yugoslavia brought together countries which were formerly from Christian, from the Austro-Habsburg Empire, with these other countries which historically were part of the Ottoman Empire, and so there's a civilizational tension there almost, which makes it a bit different from, say, Italian irredentism. But I think it is interesting that a kind of millennial pop superstar is talking about ethno-nationalism, and I do think it's an important point to talk about, that a lot of the kind of identity politics, when we talk about people coming from the global south, it can, I don't think it often does, but it can verge into forms of ethno-nationalism. Even the idea around cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is bad. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but the idea that culture is a fixed thing, which is immutable, that only certain people can perform in certain places, for me personally, I don't see a huge jump between that and ethno-nationalism, or at least, not recognizing immediately that ethno-nationalism is quite a bad thing. And by extension of that, we see often with discussions around Israel, people say, well, Israel's got the right to self-determination. I think, if we're being serious about, international protocol, Jewish settlers have been there en masse since at least the early 20th century. You can make a pretty solid argument about that. But then it becomes this kind of id-pol thing of historical repression, ergo means an ethno-state, which right now is quite rare, but I think it's becoming quite a salient thing amongst younger people. It's kind of like this thing that's quite worrying. We need to have political identities forged on on values and togetherness and meaning rather than the color of your skin or the language that your parents might speak. And it's strange to me because Dua Lipa is, for me, again, I might be wrong, she's British. She's a British Albanian. And so if you're asking for an ethno-state, be careful, because then you're not going to last here very long. I think it is, in many ways, actually expressing some quite important political conversations we've got to have on the left.
Ash,
I don't know.
Do you see a straight line between cultural appropriation or concerns about cultural appropriation and ethnic nationalism?
No, not necessarily. I don't necessarily see that link. But what I do think is true, and I was wondering if you'd agree with this, Aaron, is that sometimes when you have people who live in the diaspora, and they're, you know, that one stage removed from their heritage culture than their parents, maybe 2 steps removed, you do find sometimes people of our generation, our age group and younger going for really reactionary ideologies as a way of feeling closer to a culture, a place, a way of being that they're fundamentally really, really distant from. I remember when I was at school, for instance, there was a girl in my class who, you know, she had Hindutva everything. Like, you know those like clear big art folders that you had to take in? It was like Hindutva branding, like, and you know, she had that kind of, you know, very funny mix of like, you know, bourgeois Indian Hindutva, but also kind of like entrepreneurial go-getter spirit, like kind of mainlining Reaganism. she's a really funny girl. But it's that kind of looking for a meaning and a history which has very contemporary, you know, potentially very violent and very oppressive consequences, but because you're that one step distance from it, you're a little bit, I don't want to be patronizing to anyone, but you're a bit ignorant. You're a bit ignorant of its full consequences. Your parents and your grandparents are the ones who had to live with the nuance. They're the ones who had to live with the facts that nations are diverse, and you might feel really strongly about an ethno-state, but actually your neighbor is Serbian and they're ill, and you take them there shopping every week and you don't actually want to see them kicked out, right? We all have to exist in the gray area where there aren't these hard and fast rules. But when you're that generation removed, you can look back and turn things up to high contrast. I'm not sure if I'm expressing it well, but do you know what I mean? It's the generational thing.
I think it's a really important point you're making. Something that Ash and I share that sadly you don't have with us, Michael, is that, you know, we have, you know, we're the descendants of people who weren't from here. And so for people in Britain in the 21st century, you know, it's about forging a meaningful identity that allows us to be happy and live well. And I think that's a really important conversation again for the left to have, you know. And I think often there's this bizarre, vacuous, insipid thing about, oh, you know, Englishness or Britishness. I mean, I'm not into that. I don't like it. But clearly, you know, we live in this political entity, which is actually incredibly mixed and diverse. And I wonder what kinds of togetherness we can forge in the 21st century. To me, that's a more appealing political project than, you know, some faraway ethno-state that actually, I think, if anything, appealing to that is a reflection of alienation, right? I think that by necessity, appealing to some abstract ethno-state from a place you're not even living in, I think reflects a feeling of unease at the same time in the place that you are living in. And so I think for people of mixed heritage, I think for people whose parents are from other places, I can understand why that's appealing, the Hindutva stuff and so on. But I don't think it's going to help anyone. I don't think it's a particularly nice way to live. I don't think you'll be particularly happy doing it generally. But I do think there's a project there for people on the left to talk about coming together and forms of collectivity in the here and now, which aren't a reflection of alienation, but actually the opposite.
I mean, you were saying that Michael isn't the descendant of people who weren't from here, but the clue is in the surname. Walker, Texas Ranger.
You think?
I was making a joke.
I didn't get it though. I mean, it was probly a good joke, and I just didn't get the reference.
There's a joke about Chuck Norris and your surname.
Yeah, sorry, over my head. All right,
I'm gonna go now.
I think Michael. I think you should have a podcast called White Walker, like Game of Thrones. But then, of course, no. But then you know, this is like Richard Spencer or something like tune in and be like, "Hey, what the fuck is? What is this? This isn't what I was expecting." Anyway, this guy's like a left social democrat.
We're gonna end tonight. I think actually that developed into a very interesting conversation about identity. I suppose all I'd say is whilst obviously none of us agree with this concept of irredentism and ethnic nationalism, I do wish that pop stars would just tweet bold political statements more often, because it does make for more interesting conversations. In any case, thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then you can go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Aaron will be back tomorrow on Tuesday at 8 p.m. with Ian Cobain. That is going to be an excellent deep dive into British foreign policy. Ash and Aaron, you've been great as always, and you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.